Hello, my dear students. Welcome to Teacher at Home. Today, class, we are going to learn the first chapter, Events and Process. In section 1, we will read about the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the rise of Nazism. In different ways, all these events were important in the making of the modern world. Chapter 1 is on the French Revolution. Today, we often take the ideas of liberty, freedom, and equality for granted, but we need to remind ourselves that these ideas also have a history. By looking at the French Revolution, you will read a small part of the history. The French Revolution led to the end of the monarchy in France. A society based on privilege gave way to the new system of governance. The Declaration of the Rights of Man during the Revolution announced the coming of the new time. The idea that all individuals had rights and could claim equality became part of the new language of politics. These notions of equality and freedom emerge as the central ideas of a new age, but in different countries, they were reinterpreted and rethought in many different ways. The anti colonial movements in India and China, Africa, and South America produced ideas that were innovative and original, but they spoke in a language that gained currency only from the late 18th century. In chapter 2, we will read about the coming of socialism in Europe and the dramatic events that forced the ruling monarch, Tsar Nicholas II, to give up power. The Russian Revolution sought to change society in a different way. It raised the question of economic equality and the well being of workers and peasants. The chapter will tell you about the changes that were initiated by the new Soviet government, the problem it faced, and the measures it undertook. While Soviet Russia pushed ahead with industrialization and mechanism of agriculture, it denied the rights of citizens that were essential to the working of the democratic society. The ideas of socialism, however, became part of the anti colonial movements in different countries. Today, the Soviet Union has broken up and socialism is in crisis, but through the 20th century, it had been a powerful force in the shaping of the contemporary world. Chapter 3 will take you to Germany. It will discuss the rise of Hitler and the politics of Nazism. You will read about the children and women in Nazi Germany, about schools and concentration camps. You will see how Nazism denied various minorities a right to live, how it drew upon a long tradition of anti Jewish feelings to persecute the Jews, and how it waged a relentless battle against democracy and socialism. But the story of Nazism rise is not only about a few specific events, about massacres and killings. It is about the working of the elaborate and frightening system which operated at different levels. Some in India were impressed with the ideas of Hitler, but most were the rise of Nazism with horror. The history of the modern world is not simply a story of the unfolding of freedom and democracy. It has also been a story of violence and tyranny, death and destruction. French Revolution. On the morning of 14 July 1789, the city of Paris was in a state of alarm. The king had commanded troops to move into the city. Rumors spread that he would soon order the army to open fire upon the citizens. Some 7,000 men and women gathered in front of the town hall and decided to form a people's militia. They broke into a number of government buildings in search of arms. Finally, a group of several hundred people marched towards the esti- eastern part of the city and stormed the fortress prison, the Bastille, which were hoped to find hoarded ammunition. In the armed fight that followed, the commander of the Bastille was killed and the prisoners released, though there were only 7 of them. Yet the Bastille was hated by all because it stood for the deposit power of the king. The fortress was demolished and its stone fragments were sold in the markets to all those who wished to keep a souvenir of its destruction. The days that followed saw more rioting both in Paris and the countryside. Most people were protesting against the high price of bread. Much later, when historians look back upon this time, they saw it as the beginning of the chain of events ultimately led to the execution of the king in France, though most people of the time did not anticipate this outcome. How and why this happened? French society during the late 18th century. First estate, clergy, second nobility, third big businessmen, merchants, court lawyers, officials, lawyers, etc., peasants and artisans. small peasants, landless labor servants. In 1774, Louis XVI was of the Bourbon family of kings ascended the throne of France. He was 20 years old and married to the Austrian prince Marie Antoinette. Upon his accession, the new king found an empty treasury. Long years of war had drained the financial resources of France. Added to this was the cost of maintaining an extravagant court at the immense palace of Versailles. Under Louis XVI, France helped the 13 American colonies to gain their independence from the common enemy, Britain. The war added more than a billion lives to a debt that had already risen to more than 2 billion lives. Lenders who gave the state credit now began to charge 10% interest on loans. So the French government was obliged to spend an increasing percentage of its budget on interest payments alone. To meet its regular expenses, such as the cost of maintaining an army, the court, running government offices, or universities, the state was forced to increase taxes. Yet, even this measure would not have sufficed. French society in the 18th century was divided into three states, and only members of the third estate, paid taxes. A society of estate was part of the feudal system that dated back to the Middle Ages. The term old regime is usually used to describe society and institutions of France before 1789. Figure shows how the system of estates in French society was organized. Peasants made up of about 90% of the population. However, only a small number of them owned the land they cultivated. About 60% of the land was owned by nobles, a church, and other rich members of the third estate. Members of the first two estates, that is, the clergy and the nobility, enjoyed certain privileges by birth. The most important of these was exemption from paying taxes to the state. The nobles further enjoyed feudal privileges. These included feudal dues, which were extracted from the peasants. Peasants were obliged to render services to the lord, to work in these houses and fields, to serve in the army, to participate in building roads. The church too extracted its share of taxes called theses from the peasants, and finally all members of the third estate had to pay taxes to the state. This included a direct tax called taille and a number of indirect taxes which were levied on articles of everyday consumption like salt or tobacco. The burden of financing activities of the state through taxes was borne by the third estate alone. The poor fellow brings everything grain, fruits, money, salad. The fat lord sits there, ready to accept it all. He does not even care to grace him with a look. The struggle to survive. The population of France rose from about 23 million in 1715 to 28 million in 1789. This led to a rapid increase in the demand for food grains. Production of grains could not keep pace with the demand, so the price of bread, which was the staple diet of the majority, rose rapidly. Most workers were employed as laborers in workshops whose owner fixed their wages. But wages did not keep pace with the rise in prices. So the gap between the poor and the rich widened. Things became worse whenever drought or hail reduced the harvest. This led to subsistence crises, sometimes that occurred frequently in France during the old regime. A growing middle class envisages an end of privileges. In the past, peasants and workers had participated in revolts against increasing taxes and food scarcity, but they lacked the means of and programs to carry out full scale measures that would bring about a change in the social and economic order. This was left to those groups within the third estate who had become prosperous and had access to education and new ideas. 18th century witnessed the emergence of social groups termed the middle class who earned their wealth through an expanding overseas trade and from the manufacture of goods such as woolen and silk textile that were either exported or brought by the richer members of society. In addition to merchants and manufacturers, third estate included professions such as lawyers or administrative officials. All of these were educated and believed that no group in society should be privileged by birth. Rather, a person's social position must depend upon its merit. This idea of incentivizing a society based on freedom and equal laws, opportunities for all, were put forward by the philosophers such as John Locke and Jean Jacques Rousseau. In his treatise of government, Locke sought to refute the doctrine of the divine and absolute right of the monarch. Rousseau carried the idea forward, proposing a form of government based on the social contract between people and the representatives. In the spirit of the law, Montesquieu proposed a division of power within the government between the legislative, executive, and the judiciary. This model of government was put into force in the USA after the 13 colonies declared their independence from Britain. American Constitution and its guarantee of individual rights was an important example for political thinkers in France. Ideas of these philosophers were discussed intensively in salons and coffee houses, spread among people through books and newspapers. These were frequently read aloud in groups for the benefit of those who could not read and write. The news that Louis XVI planned to impose further taxes to be able to meet the expenses of the state generated anger and protests against the system of privileges. Outbreak of revolution. Louis XVI had to increase taxes for reasons you have learned in the previous section. How do you think he could have gone about doing this? In France of the old regime, the monarch did not have the power to impose taxes according to his will alone. Rather, he had to call a meeting to the Estates General, which would then pass his proposal for new taxes. Estates General was a political body to which the three estates sent their representatives. However, the monarch alone could decide when to call a meeting of this body. The last time it was done was in 1614. On 5th May 1789, Louis XVI called together an assembly of the Estates General to pass proposals for new taxes. A resplendent hall in Versailles was prepared to house the delegates. The first and second estates and 300 representatives each were seated in rows facing each other on two sides, while the 600 members on the third estate had to stand at the back. The third estate was represented by its more prosperous, educated members. Peasants, artisans, and women were denied entry to the assembly. However, the grievances and demands were listed in some 40,000 letters which the representative had brought with them. Voting in the estates, generally in the past, had been conducted according to the principle that each estate had one vote. This time, too, Louis XVI was determined to continue the same practice, but members of the Third Estate demanded that voting now be conducted by the Assembly as a whole, where each member would have one vote. This was one of the democratic principles put forward by philosophers like Rousseau in his book The Social Contract. When the king rejected this proposal, members of the Third Estate walked out of the assembly in protest. Representatives of the Third Estate viewed themselves as spokesmen for the whole French nation. On 20 June, they assembled in the hall of an indoor tennis court in the grounds of Versailles. They declared themselves a national assembly, swore not to disperse till they had drafted a constitution for France that would limit the powers of the monarch. They were led by Mirabeau and Abbasis. Mirabeau was born in a noble family but was convinced of the need to do away with the society of feudal privilege. He brought out the journal and delivered powerful speeches to the crowds assembled at Versailles. Abbasis, originally a priest, wrote an influential pamphlet called What is the Third Estate? While the National Assembly was busy at Versailles drafting a constitution, the rest of France suffered the turmoil. A severe winter had meant a bad harvest. The price of bread rose. Often bakers exploited the situation and hoarded supplies. After spending hours in long queues at the bakery, crowds of angry women stormed into the shops. At the same time, the king ordered troops to move into the Paris. 14 July, the agitated crowd stormed and destroyed the Bastille. The countryside rumors spread from village to village. The lords of the manor had hired bands of brigands who were on their way to destroy the ripe crops. Caught in the frenzy of fear, peasants in several districts seized hoes and pitchforks and attached chariots. They lofted hoarded grain and burned down documents containing lots of manual dues. A large number of nobles fled from the homes, many of them migrating to the neighboring countries. Faced with the power of the revolting subjects, Louis XVI finally accorded recognition of the National Assembly and accepted the principle that these powers would from now on to be checked by the Constitution. On the night of 4th August 1789, Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligation and taxes. Members of the clergy too were forced to give up the privilege. Teachers were abolished and lands owned by the church were confiscated. As a result, the government acquired assets worth of at least 2 billion lives. France becomes a constitutional monarchy. National Assembly completed the draft of the Constitution 1791. Its major objective was to limit the power of the monarch. His powers, instead of being concentrated in the hands of one person, were now separated and assigned to different institutions: legislature, executive, and judiciary. This made France a constitutional monarchy. Explains how the new political system worked. Constitution of 1791 vested the power to make laws in the National Assembly, which was indirectly elected. That is, citizens voted for a group of electors who in turn chose the assembly. Not all citizens, however, had the right to vote. Only men above 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of labor's wage were given the status of active citizens. That is, they were entitled to vote. The remaining men and all women were classed as passive citizens. To qualify as an elector and then as a member of the assembly, a man had to belong to the highest bracket of taxpayers. Constitution began with declaration of the rights of man and citizen. Rights such as the right to life, right to freedom, and right to opinion equality before law were established as the natural and inalienable rights. That is, they belong to each human being by birth and could not be taken away. It was the duty of the state to protect each citizen's natural rights. Reading political symbols. A majority of men and women in the 18th century could not read or write, so images and symbols were frequently used instead of printed words to communicate important ideas. The printing of Labour Beer uses many such symbols to convey the content of the Declaration of Rights. Let us try to read these symbols. The broken chain. Chains were used to fetter slaves. A broken chain stands for the act of becoming free. Bundle of rods or phases. One rod can be easily broken, but not an entire bundle. Strength lies in unity. The eye with a triangle radiating light. All seeing eye stands for knowledge. The rays of the sun will drive away the clouds of ignorance. Scepter, symbol of royal power. Snake biting its tail to form a ring. Symbol of eternity, a ring has neither beginning nor end. Red Phrygian cap, cap worn by a slave upon becoming free. Blue, white, red, the national colors of France. The winged women, personification of the law. The law tablet, the law is the same for all, and all are equal before it. France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. Situation in France continued to be tense during the following years. Although Louis XVI had signed the constitution, he entered into secret negotiations with the King of Prussia. Rulers of other neighboring countries too were worried by the development in France and made plans to send troops to put down the events that had been taking place there since the summer of 1789. Before this could happen, the National Assembly voted in April 1792 to declare war against Prussia and Austria. Thousands of volunteers thrown from the provinces to join the army. They saw this a war of the people against king and aristocracies all over Europe. Among the patriotic songs they sang was the Marseillaise composed by the poet Roger de Lisle. It was sung for the first time by volunteers from Marseilles as they marched into Paris and so got its name. The Marseillaise is now the national anthem for France. The Revolutionary War brought losses and economic difficulties to the people. While the men were away fighting and at the front, women were left to cope with the task of earning a living and looking after their families. Large sections of the populations were convinced that the revolution had to be carried further, as the Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer sections of society. Political clubs became an important rallying point for people who wished to discuss government policies and planned their own forms of action. The most successful of these clubs was that of the Jacobins, who got its name from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Women, too, who had been active throughout this period, formed their own clubs. Section 4 of this chapter will tell you more about the activities of demands. Members of the Jacobin Club belonged mainly to the less prosperous sections of society. They included small shopkeepers, artisans such as shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, as well as servants and daily wage workers. Their leader was Maximilien Robespierre. A large group among the Jacobins decided to start wearing long striped trousers similar to those worn by the dock workers. This was to set themselves apart from the fashionable sections of society, especially nobles who wore knee breeches. Here it is the activity given was a way of proclaiming the end of the power wielded by the weavers of knee breeches. These Jacobins came to be known as the sans-culottes, literally meaning those without knee breeches. Sans-culottes men wore in addition the red cap that symbolizes liberty. Women, however, were not allowed to do so. In the summer of 1792, the Jacobins planned an insurrection of a large number of Parisians who were angered by the short supplies and high prices of food. On the morning of August 10, they stormed the palace of the Tuileries, massacred the king's guards, and held the king himself a hostage for several hours. Later, the assembly voted to imprison the royal family. Elections were held from now on. All men of 21 years and above, regardless of wealth, got the right to vote. The newly elected assembly was called the Convention. On 21st September 1792, it abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. As you know, a republic is a form of government where the people elect the government, including the head of the government. There is no hereditary monarchy. You can try and find out about some other countries that are republics and investigate when and how they became so. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. On 21st January 1793, he was executed publicly at the Place de la Concorde. The Queen Marie Antoinette met with the same fate shortly after. The Reign of Terror. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. All those who, whom he saw as being enemies of the Republic, ex nobles and clergy, members of other political parties, even members of his own party who did not agree with his methods, were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried to a revolutionary tribunal. If the court found them guilty, they were guillotined. The guillotine is a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. It was named after de Guillotin, who invented it. Robespierre government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Meat and bread were rationed. Peasants were forced to transport their grain into cities and sell it at prices fixed by the government. Use of more expensive white flour was forbidden. All citizens were required to eat the plain, digit equally bread, a loaf made of whole wheat. Equality was also sought to be practiced through forms of speech and address. Instead of the traditional monsieur, sir, madam, all French men and women were henceforth citoyen and citoyenne. Churches were shut down and the buildings were converted into barracks or offices. Robespierre pursued his policies so relentlessly that even his supporters began to demand moderation. Finally, he was convicted by a court in July 1794, arrested, and on the next day sent to the guillotine. A directory rules France. The fall of the Jacobean government allowed the wealthier middle classes to seize power. A new constitutions were introduced which denied the vote for non-propertied sections of society. It provided for two elected legislative councils. Then they appointed a directory, and executive made up of 5 members. This was meant as a safeguard against the concentration of power in one man executive as under the Jacobins. However, the directors often clashed with the legislative councils, who then sought to dismiss them. The political instability of the directory paved the way for the rise of the military dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. Through all the changes in the form of government, ideals of freedom, of equality before the law, and of fraternity remained inspiring, ideas that motivated political movements in France and the rest of Europe during the following century. Did women have a revolution? From the very beginning, women were active participants in the events which brought about so many important changes in French society. They hoped that the involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. Most women of the third state had to work for a living. They worked as seamstresses or laundresses. Solid flowers, fruits, and vegetables at the market were employed as domestic servants in the houses of prosperous people. Most women did not have to access to education or job training. Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the third estate could study at a convent, after which their families arranged a marriage for them. Working women had also to care for their families, that is, to cook, fetch water, queue up for bread, and look after the children. Their wages were lower than those of men. In order to discuss and voice their interests, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. About 60 women's clubs came up in different French cities. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous of them. One of their main demands was the women enjoyed the same political rights as men. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced them to passive citizens. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected at the assembly, and to hold the political office. Only then, they felt, would their interests be represented in the new government. In the early years, the revolutionary government did introduce laws that helped improve the lives of women. Together with the creation of state schools, schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Their fathers could no longer force them to marriage against their will. Marriage was made into a contract, entered into freely and registered under civil law. Divorce was made legal and could be applied for it both men and women. Women could now train for jobs, could become artists or run small businesses. Women's struggle for equal political rights, however, continued during the Reign of Terror. The new government issued laws ordering closure of women's clubs, banning their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of them executed. Women's movements for voting rights and equal wages continued. Through the next 200 years, in many countries of the world, fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and early 20th century. Example of the political activities of French women during the Revolutionary years was kept alive as an inspiring memory. It was finally in 1946 women in France won the right to vote. Abolition of slavery. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobean regime. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobean regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. The colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and San Domingo were important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. But the reluctance of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands meant a shortage of labor on the plantations. So, this was meant by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americans. The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast where they bought slaves from local chieftains. Branded and shackled, the slaves were packed tightly into ships for the 3 month long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. There, they were sold to plantation owners. Exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owned their own economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. Throughout the 18th century, there were little criticism of slavery in France. National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies. But it did not pass any laws, fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade. It was finally the convention which, in 1794, legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions. This, however, turned out to be a short term measure. 10 years later, Napoleon reintroduced slavery. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interests. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies 1848. Revolution and everyday life. Can politics change the clothes people wear, the language they speak, or the books they read? The years following 1789 in France saw many such changes in the lives of men, women, and children. The revolutionary government took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideas of liberty, equality into everyday practice. One important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of the censorship in Bastille in the old regime, all written material and cultural activities. Books, newspapers, plays could be published or performed only after they had been proved by the censors of the by the king. Now the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be natural right. Newspaper pamphlets, books and printed pictures flooded the towns of France, from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside. There they all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also meant the opposing views of the events could be expressed. Each side sought to convince the others of its position through the medium of print. Plays, songs, and festive processions attracted large numbers of people. This was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in texts which only a handful of educated people could read. Conclusion. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself the Emperor of France. He set out to conquer neighboring European countries, dispersing dynasties, creating kingdoms, or replaced members of his family. Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws, such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom to the people, but soon the Napoleon armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. He was finally defeated Waterloo in 1815. Many of his measures that carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to the other parts of Europe had an impact on the people long after Napoleon had left. Ideas of the liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. They spread from France to the rest of Europe during the 19th century, where feudal systems were abolished. Colonized people reworked the idea of freedom from bondage into movements to create a sovereign nation state. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy are two examples of individuals who responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. So that's all about this chapter. If you are interested, please do like, share, and subscribe my channel. Okay, thank you.